So without further ado, let me present to you my brother from the UK by way of London, Dr. Abdul Haqq Baker.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and assalamu alaikum to my brothers and sisters who are here.
Alaikum salam.
I'm very pleased to be here in the US, and my colleagues have really rolled out the carpet for me, if I can say, so I've had a very productive time. Now, Nate mentioned the term effectiveness as he spoke, and I think we need to look at the approaches that we are having regarding countering and combating violent extremism. I've got extensive experience from a personal perspective, from an insider perspective from the UK, but that's also extended here to an extent. For example, as you'll see from the presentation, some of the individuals that I spent the 90s fighting ideologically, theologically, are now incarcerated in US maximum security prisons. Some of these individuals I knew personally, not as colleagues, but as those who were like a thorn in the side of the community because of the propagation of this poisonous rhetoric. The imagery that you've got there, that's actually a colleague of mine. We wanted that imagery because when we talk about violent extremism, when we talk about terrorism, we always look yonder. We always look to the Middle East or some far, far off country. But we've got individuals among us who have a propensity for violence as non-Muslims. And we've seen that upon them embracing Islam and being exposed to an extreme ideology or extreme propaganda, that is a very, very toxic and dangerous reality. So this imagery that's here is not just for show. It's a reality that some of us were facing. What are some of the causes? We need to understand what the drivers are. And at the moment, we're seeing that the violent extremism, the counter-radicalization industry has become just that, an industry. Many so-called experts have propped up from everywhere. What are their credentials? Some have good credentials. What is their evidence base? Where's their research based? What we see, though, is very little connectivity between the communities that are experiencing this firsthand and the wider society and statutory bodies. And that's where a misuse and a misapplication of terminology is now taking place. Because the Muslim communities need to be engaging more. This is a call and a request to the Muslim communities as well. There is a need to engage more with wider statutory bodies. There's a vacuum. And as we'll see, and my studies showed, that vacuum, that pull, is quite severe if we don't work in a multi-pronged approach in combating this. Understanding the reasons for gravitation towards violent extremism is something, again, that if we are looking in our own lanes at this, you've got intelligence services taking a particular approach. You've got the communities having a particular insular approach. Both moving in their own lanes. No convergence whatsoever. So then what we have is that the data and intelligence that the statutory bodies are getting use of terminology which further marginalizes orthodox, socially conservative practicing Muslims. Then you have this suspicion, some of it previously valid from Muslim communities, when they are looking at engaging or the reluctance to engage with statutory bodies. And I would say to Muslim communities as well, a brave step needs to be made, like what happened in the UK. When we were approached by a new unit that had been set up in the Metropolitan Police called the Muslim Contact Unit, I was reluctant. When I was called and they said that a Muslim individual came to me, didn't make me any more trusting. But when we looked at their remit, and their remit was of a key word, which you're going to hear some of my colleagues talk about today, partnership. Partnership, a two-way process. Not the previous top-down, coercive, intelligence-gathering sort of structure that we've seen from the police and statutory bodies. And so we tested those waters. And those waters enabled us to be facilitated to continue the work that we were doing. Facilitation. This is a very interesting theoretical framework that was produced by the Combating Terrorism Centre. And when I looked at this particular framework, I decided to use it and test it in my PhD. And this could be applied to different types of Muslim communities. If you were to look at the Deobandi Sufi Muslim community, for example, you will have different communities. You'll have different bases there. But we wanted to focus on this one. This is the one they spoke about. Now, this is not concentric circles showing a gravitation towards extremism. It's showing where communities posit themselves, where communities situate themselves in wider communities. And as you'll see very shortly, for example, some may position themselves in the Muslim constituency, the wider, larger Muslim body of religious Muslims. Then you might move into a more politicized community, the Islamist, Ikhwani Muslimin type of basis, the politicized type of community. Then you have the Salafi community, which is more ideologically, theologically based. Then you have that smaller jihadi, and I will talk about that terminology, jihadi. I prefer to use the term khariji or takfiri, because that's the extremist community where they lurk. They sit within these wider communities due to familiarity, be it physical and somewhat ideologically. And we need to familiarize ourselves with this. And I'll give you an example why. Zacchaeus Moussaoui, Richard Reed. I knew both of them. I used to go to university with Zacchaeus Moussaoui. I was doing my MBA, he was doing a business management course. And I watched as he became more belligerent when he would come back to the mosque. I was the chairman of Brixton Mosque for 15 years. And as he returned to the mosque, he became more argumentative. And we challenged some of his views. And it was clear that he was going to other arenas, not mosques. I want to make that very clear now. Radicalization, from my research and many others, Muslim, non-Muslim academics, does not take place in the mosques. They take place in other spaces which we do not know, or we do not visit, or we do not engage or challenge with. So he was going to other study circles, other premises where Abu Hamza was, where other extremists, Abdullah al-Faisal, Abu Qatada were, and he was getting a rhetoric that our understanding, the Salafi understanding, the community I was from, of jihad is wrong. But why am I talking about this particular path? I will go back to this so you can look at this. When Zacchaeus Moussaoui was French-Moroccan, he wasn't really a practicing Muslim in his early days. He was in Montpellier. There was a lot of social deprivation and economic marginalization of these particular communities. However, when he started attending university, he started meeting students from various walks of life within the Islamist community. They were talking about politics. They were talking about the situation in Algeria. They were talking about the situation in other foreign lands, Palestine. He eventually left France, and when he came to the UK, he gravitated towards the Salafi community. His frustration with the Islamist community is that it was politicized. There was no religiosity. It was just politics. When he moved into the Salafi community, he saw there was theology, ideology. They were religiously based and very strong in what they were in their theology. But then he saw a passivity that he didn't like. I remember him engaging with me and saying, "You don't talk about jihad." Bosnia was on at the time. "Why are you not talking about jihad? Where are the scholars, Abdul Haqq? You're passive, you're weak." And we said, this is not the way. This is not the correct understanding of jihad. It was unsurprising, therefore, that he gravitated to a community that said it combined both politics, the Islamist community, and ideology, the Salafi community. And with his very rudimentary understanding, he found that community to be the one that resonated with him the most. Richard Reed was the same. His gravitation when he came out of prison was a lot quicker. His radicalization and the process of radicalization was a lot quicker in the 90s. I think many of us know, and I'm going to move on quickly because of time, many of us know the process nowadays is much faster than we've ever seen before. The process of radicalization is phenomenal at this particular stage. But I'll put a question out. What are the countermeasures that we are using? Are they as potent as the propaganda that we're seeing from the extremists? We'll leave that question to a later time. Moving on. I mentioned earlier about the communities. it is important that statutory bodies do not do what has happened in the UK. Initially, under the PREVENT strategy, it was community-focused, partnership, engagement, facilitation of communities that were equipped, had the credibility to address extremism and propaganda. But then they changed it and reverted to the age-old community-focused, community-targeted, suspect communities, wanting data and intelligence. And that's why the PREVENT strategy as it is now is seen as very, very toxic. I won't pay too long on these particular spectrums here. But what we've got to look at is if the government goes for a very liberal set of Muslims to counter-radicalization, those youth on the ground will reject that. Just like they've rejected their parents' traditional aspects of Islam. And you have a pendulum swing effect. To which side? The fanatical, violent, extreme side. What we need to be looking at as statutory partners and statutory bodies are those in the middle. And unfortunately, we're seeing a polarization of government strategy as well. They want a particular brand of Islam, and so therefore they overlook those most effective in countering it. This next framework I don't want to spend too much time on, but it gives an idea of where particular groups and entities from a UK perspective are positioned and their effectiveness in that regard. We can revisit this, but I'm mindful of the time. I want you to look at this particular framework that I developed. This is a cross-section of the funnel theory. You'll see the wider outer circle is wider society. Then you have the more generic Muslim communities. Inside you have the more insular but theologically based communities. And then you have that vacuumous pull down the middle. You may then say, well, okay, that gravitation is dangerous. No, I say look at it a different way. Those closest to the problem, most effective in the problem, are the ones that should be engaged, we're engaging with. If we understand the individuals like Richard Reed, Zacharias Moussaoui, the Adebolajo, a murderer of Lee Rigby, and his colleague Adebowale, the individuals who disappeared to Syria, they went through that vacuum. But there was not the joined-up multi-agency approach where credible partners were being engaged to counter this. I'm going to conclude on this point here. And I'm sorry that we're going at speed, but the rest of this presentation in the subsequent panels, I will be addressing and revisiting some of these frameworks. But when we look at this particular framework here, you'll see I've noted at the very mouth of the funnel, which is the pressure is less. You have the more liberal, I've put extreme for provocation, deliberate provocation. You've got the more liberal aspects of society, Muslim communities, who do not have an effectiveness in addressing and counteracting violent extremism and the propaganda. As you go down and the gravitational pull becomes stronger, we get to the neck of the funnel. And there have been communities for the last 30 years combating through their communities, through their pulpits, through their written material, combating violent extremism. And what has been witnessed is a reflux. That some of the individuals who were being pulled down into violent extremism would stop at the neck of the funnel. Or if they'd gone down to the neck of the funnel, they would come back when they've realized that what they have seen with extremist rhetoric, with extremist propaganda, as those who are finding out in Syria, in Iraq, and those who still are positioned here without traveling, that they've been fed a lie, that they've been fed misunderstanding, misrepresentation of the very religion that they are practicing. And later on, I'm going to show you the stages of development of these individuals and as to why they were so vulnerable or susceptible at these particular stages. So I want to hand over to Dr. Tahir, because where I want you to be looking on this particular funnel is at the neck where the hard-end interventions need to take place. And I'll stop on this point. When we talk about hard-end interventions, it's not necessarily easy. And my Muslim colleagues who are here, we are very reluctant to call out the extremists. We may call out and refer to the ideology and show how poisonous that is, but we're very reluctant to call out the extremists. I will mention names. We called out Abu Qatada. We called out Abdullah al-Faisal. We called out Abu Hamza. That was within our own sphere. Now, that doesn't mean, some may say, what do you mean called out? Did you inform the police? No, we were doing our own work. That was in the 90s. The authorities caught up, 2005, 2010, 10, 15 years later. All of those individuals are no longer on UK shores, UK land. As you know, some of them are here. And we need to look at those who are most effective at the neck of the funnel to combat extremism and not marginalise them and not coin new terminology like Cameron did in 2011 in his Munich speech, non-violent extremism. Non-violent extremism exists. It exists. But to apply that carte blanche against a wide swathe of Muslims is a disservice and an injustice. And I'll conclude at this particular point and carry on with the next panel. Thank you for listening.